Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. My name is Oluseyi Yoloye. I'm one of the product management fellows with Coding It Forward. Today, I'll be talking about what we worked on this summer, which was improving Boston's marriage intention form, turning prototypes into processes. And I would like to take this time to thank our partners, which were Mayor Michelle Wu, the Department of Innovation and Technology within the City of Boston, and Coding It Forward. So now I'd like to introduce our team. So to the left, we have Marion, who's a user research fellow, Ryan, who's a product management fellow, myself, who's a product management fellow, and Julia, who works for the Boston Digital Service as a chief digital officer. So about 4 weeks ago, we were approached by the registry department to improve the flow and experience of the marriage intention form. And this was really our goal at a high level and to make sure that the form was inclusive and accessible for all city residents. So to the left is the actual legal documentation of the marriage intention form that couples fill out before receiving an official marriage license. And as you can see, it collects certain personal identifying information such as your name, date of birth, and parental information. So why redesign the marriage intention form, which is a really good question. So it was recently highlighted as a pain point for LGBTQ constituents in research studies done by the City of Boston and USDR, which is US Digital Response on Gender Inclusivity. And this was also motivated by the Gender Ordinance, which was passed in 2020, which wanted to ensure gender inclusivity on all city forms. Also, it was quickly moved online at the onset of COVID and has never been really evaluated on best practices on digital forms. So it was really at a high level important to redesign this form to make sure that was included within all other forms as well. So with this motivation in hand, we really saw two opportunities, which was one, to turn our research findings into actionable changes, and to also create materials to guide the future forms at the city. So now I'll hand it over to Marion to talk a little bit more about our process.
Yeah, before we dive into our process, I just wanted to touch briefly on our key stakeholders. So we worked with staff members from the registry who work with couples every day to fill out the marriage intention form. We also worked with PMs and developers from the Boston Digital Service who are responsible for developing and making changes to the form. In the 4 weeks we had for this project, we took a 5-step approach, starting with evaluating the form and determining its requirements, then moving on to prototyping the form, testing it with users and revising it based on their feedback, and wrapping it up by handing it off to our stakeholders. We're going to use this time to walk through each step of our process, starting with evaluation. To evaluate this form, we synthesized learnings and feedback from a few sources, including industry best practices on digital forms, research findings from the City of Boston and the USDR on the LGBTQ+ experience, and a feedback survey sent out by the registry. The output of that synthesis was a form evaluation, which we used to evaluate the form in 8 key areas. So as you can see here, there's just an example of our team using that form evaluation in practice. This process helped us identify 3 elements that we should target in our redesign, which are highlighted on the slide. In orange, we see safety and privacy, which is all about making sure that people filling out the form are informed about what data is being collected, why it's being collected, and how it will be kept secure. This is especially important because this form asks for a lot of personal information. In yellow, we see respect and inclusion, which is all about honoring people's identities by using language that is respectful and inclusive. Focusing on this was key to addressing feedback that users had been offering around some of the language and assumptions that the form was making that made it hard for users to fill out. Finally, in green, ease of progression was about making the form as easy to fill out as possible by making it easy to scan and using language that people are familiar with and not confused by. We walked away from this phase with 2 things. The first one being a list of problem areas to focus on in our redesign, and the second thing being a form evaluation that can be reused for other forms of the city. You'll notice that in each of these phases, we'll be returning to these opportunities because throughout this process, we are not only thinking about the changes that we can make to this one form, but the practices that we could institutionalize for other forms. After evaluation, we met with members from the registry and the digital service team to learn about the technical and legal requirements of the form. And then we moved on to prototyping, which I'll hand off for Ryan.
Awesome. So now we reached the prototyping stage. And so in this stage, we worked on building a fully interactive and clickable prototype. which you can see a GIF of here, seeing the usability of drop-downs, different buttons that are clickable, radio buttons, so that our users in the future can interact with it and our developers can understand it. And so I'm going to dive into some of the changes that we made based on informed from our form evaluations and best practices. So first, we wanted to set expectations more clearly. And so as you can see, the original is on the left and the version 1 is on the right. One of the first things we did is we focused on installing a new navigation bar. This allows for more clarity. The previous one was a single line horizontal bar with a blue progression. However, this one states the different phases of the progression so that you can understand how many steps there will be in the coming process, and allows you to click between them at different points. We also improved the text about what to expect. Previously on the left, if you can read it, it asks you what you bring to the appointment when you go in person, but it doesn't tell you anything about how to fill out the form that you're currently looking at. So we added some text about how long this might take, about 15 minutes, and the things that it might ask for. Then in the actual form itself, when we ask for information, we found ways to regroup the questions so that it made more sense and was easier to progress for the user. So things like date of birth and birthplace both relate to birth. We were able to condense them into place and date of birth. And then we had residence, and residence had 2 questions underneath it. One asking, what is your residence? And the other asking if this is your first, second, or third marriage, which doesn't really relate to your residence. And so we wanted to find a way to separate that. So we put residence in its own section and marriage in its other section, and allowed for a few other questions in the marriage section. Then after that, we also introduced required and optional tags, and this allowed for a little more clarity on what questions are required, what's optional, because that wasn't previously there. Then from a more safety and privacy standpoint, we also created helper boxes with additional legal information so that users understood where was the information going, where was it being collected for, and what was the reason behind that. We also removed gendered language. Previously on the left side, you can see it says name of parent 1/mother or name of parent 2/father. And we wanted to be respectful and inclusive of all different people. And so we removed that language to say parent 1 and parent 2 to make that more accessible. And finally, we also added instructions for different levels of parental information. Some people don't have 2 parents that they can list on this form. And so we wanted the ability to add not applicable if that is an option. So we provided some instructions for that. So in this prototyping phase, we seized 2 opportunities. We created the interactive prototype that reflected these changes from the evaluations that we conducted and the requirement gathering that we conducted. And also for the long term, we built a suite of reusable Figma components so that for future form design in the city of Boston, people can actually reuse these form components and not have to redesign the form many, many times again. So next we moved into the testing and revising stage. And this is where we wanted to take our prototype that we just showed you and put it in front of actual users. So we reached out to various people who are in the process of getting married or applying for a marriage license with the major research question of what's the experience of people who are filling out this form. We asked things like what's going well with it, what's not working well. And we really wanted to send from those 3 elements. Ease of progression, safety and privacy, respect and inclusion. And one is that users are really concerned about screwing up their information, especially on legal documents, given that this is a legal document, especially when there might be an inconsistency among their documents or among their different identifications. Users also had trouble seeing the distinction between headings and questions visually. And also users we found did not actually interact with the helper boxes that we thought would have made it feel more safe and private. And so after this, we looked to how do we improve, how do we iterate and revise this? And so we wanted to set better expectations. So as you can see on the left, that was our version 1. And we tried to make it more visually distinguishable on the right in the new Getting Started page. We also specified the documents that might be helpful so people can pull out their birth certificate when they're starting. They can pull out their ID. They know exactly what to work off of. And also added some comforting and affirming language to say that this, yes, is a legal document, but there is an opportunity to change that when you come in for your personal appointment. So please don't be too concerned. We also tried to add new section headers into the different segments. And so that you can see here of person 1 became a little bit bigger. And then we also removed the helper boxes and actually just replaced it with clarifying text so that it's right in front of you. You don't have to hover, you don't have to interact. There's no sort of other element there. You just get it presented and you can also skip over it if that's not of interest to you. And then we also changed any non-applicable options to radio buttons. We realized that non-applicable might not translate well to other languages. It might not be as accessible to people who don't understand what that means as an acronym. And a radio button is easier to ask, do you have a second parent? Do you have a surname that you want to change to? So finally, we're talking about the handoff. That's the last sort of phase of our process. And for that, we've sort of made a list of changes and a side-by-side comparison of what the original form looked like versus what our final version looks like to guide that implementation. And we also then developed a shared suite of resources. We put the form evaluation together. We have the Figma components. We have an understanding to push forward for all different forms across the city so that the gender ordinance that asks to review all city forms can actually go into action a lot easier and that we don't have to redo the work. And so we wanted to finish up talking about what are our learnings? What did we take away from this summer? And so I think there's three things that we can center on. The first is, how do we design a successful handoff? We're learning that right now as we hand off to our team this final week and ensuring that we have all our documents in one place, that we have a clear understanding of who takes ownership of this, that we have built the relationships to make sure it's carried on. We're also thinking about how do we institutionalize the process. As you can see, every step along the way, we found opportunities not only to change the urgent issue in the short term, but to also center on how do we improve the long-term goals and how do we fix those outcomes? And so we institutionalize by building components, by building an evaluation. And finally, the value of an engaged stakeholder. The registry department, specifically Paul Chong and Jessica Joyce, were extremely, extremely helpful and really supportive at making this happen. They put everything they had into ensuring that we had the resources to do this. We wanted to give everyone our gratitude who was a part of previously the USDR study and also this current project at Coding It Forward and do it in various departments. Thank you so much. And if you have any questions, feel free to raise your hand. Yeah, Risha?
Yeah, I was wondering if you ended up testing the prototypes like with the fully interactive prototypes that you built, or did you do it a different way? Like, how exactly did you test it?
Yeah, so we took the fully the link to the Figma prototype and we sent it to our users in the video calls that we were doing for user research. And they were actually able to scroll through it on their site and share their screen with us so we could see the exact buttons they were clicking or the places where they clicked. That's how we sort of grasped that they weren't actually hovering on the hover text. And we were like, oh, that's a very big change from the previous one. We would assume people would hover over it and then they didn't. So that was a really good insight to glean from that. Yeah.
This isn't so much a question as just a thank you, like, because I'm trans and like so many times there's a form that just says like gender and I don't know what to put because I don't know if it wants what's correct or if it wants what's on my birth certificate or what's on my driver's license, and there's people for whom all of those are different answers. And so like having something that says like just put whatever or this needs to be consistent with X other document is so helpful, and I appreciate that very much. Thank you very much.
Yeah, Dylan?
Hey, I'm on mobile, so hope you all can hear me okay. But really, really great work, especially the emphasis on institutionalizing best practices. As a former fellow, I think that's something that often gets lost once we leave. So great work there. My question is about adoption of your project. Do you know when it's going to be rolled out, what the process or approval kind of looks like to get it adopted, and when should we see it on the website for the city of Boston?
Yeah, that's a good question. We are actually in the midst of our handoffs right now. So we're working with the development team tomorrow to actually scope out an epic for it, or scope out sort of a project plan for how this might get done. There are certainly changes that are really quick and easy to make that can be made on the side of the registry, and then changes that are going to have to be balanced with the other priorities of the development team.
I think there was one more hand, or maybe not.
Oh yeah, I had a question, but Marianne, you actually answered it just now. I was just wondering, like, I was curious about this part of the fellowship, like the product and design part, just because I wasn't sure exactly what it encompassed. So I was curious about, like, after designing all of the pages and all of the features, whether you would also be doing like the development of it, or whether it's more just like the design of it and the, you know, getting it handed off and all of that. But I think you just said that you were going to be in contact with the development team afterwards, so that answered it.
I have.
Sorry, go.
Ryan, Oluseyi, what was most surprising about this process?
I think personally for me, what was most surprising was like I wouldn't say the lack, but somewhat of the lack of inclusivity, like considering the day and age we live in now. So I'm really glad like we were able to like implement that throughout our project and really have that as like a spearheading guide to make sure that like these forms are inclusive for everyone that accesses them.
I think for me, it was more how this forum sits in the overall process. For context, everyone, we learned about the extent of the process, which might need its own separate review. But effectively, this part is extremely digitized. And once it is submitted through the database and the data is collected, it actually is directly printed onto the piece of paper that is used for the printed form. And so they slide the form in, and it has to align such that we heard that one large concern was that long names are a challenge because it doesn't fit the actual piece of paper that it's being printed onto. And so we were like, that's a large challenge that could be improved on for the future. And so we tried to think of other things in the process overall, but that was kind of surprising to me.